The first thing the cowboy noticed about the woman on his porch was that her shoes were wrong. They had been made for marble floors and Sunday sermons. They had no business being on his weathered boards, and the dust was already turning them the color of his land. He watched her from the barn doorway where he had been mending a halter, his hands still holding the leather needle. Watching her stand there in a dress that cost more than his horse, and not 1 inch of it fit the situation she was in. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love knowing who's with us. She did not knock. She did not call out. She stood the way a person stands when they have been told in front of witnesses that they no longer exist. The kind of standing that comes after a door has been closed on you in a way that doors are not supposed to close. Her chin was up. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were the color of creek water in early summer, and she was not crying, and that was the thing that told him the most. His name was Abel Renner, and he had lived alone on the Broken Arrow for almost 3 years. That was the short way of saying his wife had died on a January morning while he was out checking the south fence line, and his daughter had followed her 2 days later, and the midwife had set the small grave beside the larger one, and Abel had not spoken a word above a whisper for the better part of a year. He set down the needle. He walked across the yard. He did not ask her name. He asked her if she had eaten. She said she had not. The word came out smaller than she meant it to. She straightened when she said it. She had been trained since girlhood to take up the correct amount of space. He brought her inside. He set bread and a tin plate of cold beans on the table. He poured water from the pitcher, not coffee, because his wife had been the one who kept coffee in the house, and he had not been able to bring himself to learn how. She ate like she had been taught to eat. Small bites. Eyes on the plate. The way children are taught in houses where manners are a form of armor. It was only after she had slowed down that she looked up at him, and Abel saw that she had been afraid of him since before he opened the door, and the fear had not left even when he gave her bread. "My name is Clara," she said. "It is not the name my father gave me, but it is the name I have chosen." He nodded. He did not ask who her father was. He figured a woman who arrived in good shoes with a name she had chosen had a story she was not ready to tell, and he had learned something from his 3 quiet years that no book could have taught him. That story could wait. That bread could not. She slept in the small bedroom at the back of the house, the room where his daughter had slept. Abel did not say this. There was nothing to say about it. He set a quilt on the bed. He set a candle on the table. He walked back to his chair by the cold hearth and sat down and tried to think of nothing, which was his usual way of trying to sleep. He did not sleep. Across the territory, in the county seat, Judge Hollis Whitcomb sat in his paneled office with a glass of bourbon and a fury he could taste. His only daughter had been removed from the family registry that morning by his own hand. He had read the document aloud to her, every word, signed it, had a clerk witness it, and then he had told the driver to take her wherever she wanted to go, and he had not watched the carriage leave because he was a man who did not watch the things he had broken. The girl had refused Rutger Vance. That was the whole of it. Rutger was the largest landowner south of the river, and he had come to the judge with an offer. His water rights and his rolling grassland, in exchange for the judge's daughter and a quiet marriage. The judge had accepted the offer 3 days before he told his daughter about it. He had accepted it because Rutger's water ran through the only watering place for 30 miles in dry years, and the judge had debts that could not be paid with the salary of a county seat. When Clara said no, the judge did not see a daughter. He saw a debt that had grown legs and walked away. He drained his glass. He told his clerk that tomorrow he would begin the search. He told his clerk that when they found her, she was to be returned to the family home where she could be reasoned with by people who knew how to handle her. He did not say which people. He did not need to. The county had a small prison built for holding men who owed fines, and it had held women before, when the right kind of man needed the right kind of lesson taught. In the morning, Abel woke to the sound of someone working. He walked out to the porch and Clara was in the chicken yard, refilling the water trough, and the 4 chickens were watching her like she was a stranger who had somehow already earned their trust. She had rolled her sleeves up to her elbows. Her hair was tied back. The dust on her shoes from the day before had been joined by dust from the chicken yard, and she was wearing the same dress, but the dress had already begun to look like it belonged to the land. He almost smiled. He caught himself before it landed. He walked her through the work of the place, where the well was, which horses could be trusted and which could not, which fence posts leaned from rot and which leaned from gophers. He did not explain why he was teaching her. She did not explain why she was learning so fast. They worked in the kind of quiet that two people share when they have both been taught that asking is a kind of begging. By the third day, the kitchen smelled like coffee for the first time since Evelyn died. Clara had found an old tin of beans at the back of a cabinet and had asked him where the coffee was kept, and he had told her he did not keep any, and she had gone into town and bought a pound with money he did not know she had, and had made a pot without asking his permission. He came in from the barn. He smelled it from 30 feet out. He walked to the door and stood there, and the ground beneath him felt, for a quarter of a second, like the kind of ground a man can stand on without thinking about falling. He said thank you. She said nothing. She set the cup at his place and sat down across from him with her own cup held in both hands, and the steam rose between them like a small weather of its own. It was then that one of his hands reached across the table and pushed a stray hair back from her face. The hand did that on its own. He saw what it had done a second after it had done it. He pulled it back. He did not apologize because apologizing would have admitted it had meant something, and he was not yet sure it had, and he was not yet sure that the man he had been for the last 3 years was the man who was allowed to mean anything. Clara did not flinch. Clara did not smile. She lifted her cup. She drank. Her eyes stayed on him in a way that told him she had understood what the hand had meant, and that she was not ready to talk about it, and that this was its own kind of conversation, and it would do for now. The judge had men everywhere. He had always had men everywhere. He had built his court's empire on being owed favors by every sheriff, every deputy, every clerk, every freight operator between the county seat and the territorial line. The search that he had promised began on a Tuesday and ended on a Friday with the name of a small ranch on the Broken Arrow, 10 miles from anything, owned by a man who had never asked the county for so much as a fence post. Abel found out because the man who told him was a deputy named Foster, who had been a friend of his father, and who rode out to the ranch after his shift was over and told Abel in the voice a man uses when he wishes he had been born somewhere else. "They are coming for her," Foster said. "2 of them, maybe 3. They have a paper that says she is a ward of the court. It is signed by the judge. It is not worth the ink, but it is enough rope for a hanging if no one stands in the way." Foster sat his horse and looked at the house. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "I cannot help you. I am sorry. I have a daughter too." Abel watched him right away. He stood in the yard and thought about what it would mean to lose this house. He thought about Evelyn and the small grave and the coffee this morning. He thought about his hands reaching across the table. He went inside. He told her. She sat very still while he told her. When he finished, she said, "He is my father." He sat down across from her because his legs had made the decision for him. She said, "His name is Judge Whitcomb. He has ruled this county for 16 years. He has married off 3 of his clerks to settle debts. He has sent 2 men to prison for insulting his wife. He ruined a man named Garrigan by changing the line of a road, so the road missed Garrigan's only well and went through a piece of land Judge Whitcomb had bought the week before." She said this in the voice a person uses when they have grown up listening to their own father's cruelty and have learned every chapter of it without ever being taught to defend against it. He did not feel safe around her in the old way. He felt something closer to standing in the open with the wind coming straight at him and realizing you are not cold. He said, "What did you do?" She said, "I would not marry a man I had never met. I would not sell myself for a water deed." He said, "So he came for you." She said, "He came for me because he could." She said, "Because no one has ever told him that he could not." They looked at each other across the table for a long time. The coffee had gone cold. The chickens were quiet outside. The wind was pushing the screen door against its frame in a slow and patient way. What would you have done in her place? Would you have told him who you were? Would you have stayed quiet and tried to survive? We want to know what you think. Tell us in the comments. It matters to us to know who is listening tonight. The men came on a Wednesday morning. They came with the paper and with a second rider who had not been part of the original plan. The second rider was Rutger Vance himself, who had told the judge he would not sign the water deed until the girl was back, and who had ridden out to make sure the judge understood that this was not a negotiating position. Abel saw them from the porch. He had known they would come on a Wednesday, because Wednesdays were when the judge liked to make his appearances, the way a man likes to be seen in his office on a particular morning. Abel stepped off the porch and walked to the yard. He did not carry a rifle. He carried his hands. because the only thing that had kept him alive in the years since Evelyn was the knowledge that the wrong kind of courage gets a man buried 3 weeks before his family would have come looking for him. The lead deputy read the paper. He read it the way a man reads a piece of paper that he knows is not worth the horse he rode in on, but that he cannot stop reading because his name is on the back of it. He looked up when he finished. He said, "The court orders the return of Clara Whitcomb to her father's custody." Clara had stepped onto the porch. She stood behind Abel. She did not speak. Abel said, "Her name is Clara Renner." The deputy looked at the paper. The deputy looked at Abel. The deputy looked at Rutger Vance, sitting his horse at the back of the yard with a face like a closed gate. The deputy said, "The paper says Whitcomb." Abel said, "The paper is wrong." Rutger Vance swung down from his horse. He was a big man in the way that big men in this country tend to be big, which is to say that he had been built by work and then preserved by what work had given him. He walked toward Abel. He said, "You are a fool. You are a tenant on ground that runs out of water the day after my deed is signed. You will not be a tenant at all if you finish this sentence the way you have begun it." Abel did not step back. Rutger was close enough that Abel could smell the pomade in his hair and the bourbon on his breath. Abel said, "My wife is buried on this land. My daughter is buried on this land. The girl behind me has slept in my daughter's room. If you want her, you will have to walk over both graves to get to her, and I do not think your boots are built for it." The deputy shifted his weight. The deputy looked at Foster, who had ridden out after his shift with a single companion, and who had positioned himself at the edge of the yard with his hand resting not on his holster, but on his belt, the way a man rests his hand when he wants it visible. Foster said, "I will not sign the return. I will not countersign. The paper has no second witness. If you want to take her, you will have to take her by force. And if you take her by force, I will write what I saw, and I will mail it to the territorial governor before the weekend. And the governor has been waiting for an excuse to break this court for 2 years, and he does not have an excuse yet." Rutger looked at Foster. Rutger looked at the deputy. Rutger looked at Abel. Rutger swung back up onto his horse. He said, "This is not over." He said, "The judge will remember this." He said it in the voice of a man who has lost the first move of a game he thought he had already won. He wrote. The deputy stood for another minute. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat. He said, "I am sorry, Abel." He said, "A man does what his name tells him to do, until the day his name does not." He wrote. Abel turned around. Clara was standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself. The wind had picked up. The chickens had gone into the coop. The yard was empty of everyone except the 2 of them and the small patches of damage the horses had made in the soft ground. He walked back to the porch. He stopped at the bottom step. He said, "Foster will not always be able to do that." He said, "The judge has the kind of memory that keeps a list and crosses names off at one at a time." She said, "I know." He climbed the stairs. He stood beside her. He did not touch her because he had not yet learned how, but he was close enough that she could feel how much he wanted to, and she did not move away from the closeness, and the wind did the rest. That night, she made dinner. She had found a recipe of Evelyn's on a piece of paper in a drawer and had spent an hour rebuilding it from memory and what was in the pantry. She set the table with the good plates because Evelyn had left good plates and she had decided without asking that they ought to be used. He sat down across from her, and she served him, and he ate like a man who had not been hungry in the way he had been hungry in a long time. And when she sat down with her own plate, he looked at her across the table in the candlelight. He said, "Tell me about her." She did not ask who. She said, "My mother died when I was 6. He buried her on a Tuesday. He married her sister on a Saturday. He raised me to be kind and quiet and obedient, because kind and quiet and obedient was the woman my aunt had been." She said, "I was kind. I was quiet. I was obedient. It did not protect me." He said, "What did you keep?" She said, "I kept the kitchen." He said, "What?" She said, "I kept the kitchen. I watched my aunt cook for him and for the men he brought home. She made the same dish for the right kind of guest and a different dish for the wrong kind of guest, and I learned the difference without being taught." She said, "When I was 12, I could tell you the political future of any man who sat at our table by what my aunt served him." She said, "He never noticed that I was watching. He taught me to read law books at his elbow so I could understand what he was signing, and I learned. I learned everything he did not intend to teach me." Abel sat back in his chair. He looked at her. He realized that she had grown up inside the machine that had come for her, and she had read its blueprints without its knowing, and she had walked out of it with the only weapon that mattered, which was the knowledge of what it was and what it was not. He said, "We will not win by running." She said, "No." He said, "What do we have?" She said, "We have Foster, who has a daughter the same age I was when I started watching. We have 3 other families on this road who have lost wells to him." She said, "We have the territorial judge who has been looking for a way to break my father for 2 years and does not have a paper clean enough to do it with." Abel said, "What do you need?" She said, "I need the records of the road rerouting. I need the names of the men in prison. I need the names of the women he married off. I need 3 honest men, 2 honest women, and 1 judge who has not yet sold his name." He said, "I have a hand that does not shake when it writes." They looked at each other across the table. The candles had burned low. The good plates were empty. The wind had stopped. He reached across the table. He did not push a stray hair back. He turned her hand over. He traced the lines in her palm as if he were reading a map. He said, "Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you." She closed her hand around his finger. She did not let go. "If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for." A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. It costs you nothing, and it tells us that stories like this one are wanted in this world. The records came one at a time. Foster sent the prison ledgers wrapped in oilcloth inside a flour sack. The 3 families sent letters signed by women who had watched their wells go dry and who had been told by the judge that water was a gift, not a right. A clerk's widow sent a leather journal that had belonged to her husband and that contained the names and the dates and the amounts of every debt the judge had ever called in by marriage. Clara read each one in the kitchen by the window. She wrote down each name in a ledger of her own. She cross-referenced every record so that the same affidavit appeared 3 times in 3 different hands, the way a story becomes reliable when it has been told by enough people that it can no longer be called rumor. Abel drove her to the territorial capital. He did not ask where to go. She told him. He drove for 2 days without complaining, and he bought her new shoes in a town along the way because he had noticed that the old ones had worn through at the toe, and because a woman should not walk into a courthouse in broken shoes, even when the courthouse belongs to the people who threw her out of her family's house. The territorial judge was a man named Kyle Bram. He was small. He was patient. He had been waiting for the kind of paper that Clara was carrying because he had spent 10 years wearing out his welcome in his own chambers by writing letters to the governor about the county seat and receiving nothing back. He read the ledger in his office with the door closed. He read it for an hour. When he came out, he sent for the governor's aide. The warrant was issued before the week was out. It named the judge, 3 of his deputies, a county clerk, and 2 landowners whose deeds had come from the judge's hand under conditions that no honest court would have allowed. It was signed by the territorial judge. It was witnessed by the governor's aide. It was carried by 2 United States Marshals who had been raised on ranches and who understood the particular language of a man caught in the act of ruining the people around him. The judge was arrested at his own desk. He was still wearing the robe. He was still holding the bourbon glass. He looked up when the marshals came in, and his mouth opened, and his mouth did not produce a word because he had never been in a room where his name did not open every door for him. And he was in that room now, and his name had not opened the door in time. Rutger Vance was arrested 3 days later, on a Thursday, while he was sitting on the porch of his own house writing a letter to a man in Denver about a quarter of land that did not belong to him. The marshals took the letter from his hand. They read it in front of him. They folded it and put it in their coat. He did not say another word for the rest of the afternoon. The trial was held in the territorial capital. Clara testified for 2 days. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She spoke in the same register in which she had learned to read law books at her father's elbow, and the courtroom listened to her in the way that courtrooms listen to people who have carried something for a long time and have decided to set it down in front of strangers because the weight of it has become larger than the room. Her father was sentenced to 10 years. The water deeds were voided. The road was rerouted back to the original line. The wells were restored to the families who had owned them. The clerk's widow was given a pension. The 2 landowners who had been married off were given the option of annulment, and both of them took it, and both of them moved away in the spring to a town where their names had not yet been spoken. Foster was promoted. He accepted the promotion with the kind of quietness that a man wears when he has done a thing he is proud of and does not want to be famous for it. Clara came home to the ranch. Abel was on the porch when she stepped out of the wagon. The sun was in her eyes. The chickens were in the yard. The coffee was on the stove. He stood up and walked down the stairs and took her hand, and she pulled him toward her by the front of his shirt, and she rested her forehead against his chest, and they stood in the yard like that for a long time without saying a word. They were married that autumn by Foster, who fumbled through the ceremony because he had never performed one before and because his own daughter had insisted on being the only witness and had cried through the whole thing. The seasons turned. The ranch grew. The water stayed. The well that had nearly been lost began to run with a sound that could be heard from the porch when the wind was right. In the spring of the third year, a baby girl came to the Renner house in the way that babies come to houses that have been empty of them for a long time, weighing nothing, taking up everything. They named her Evelyn. They did not speak the name aloud when they named her. They let Clara say it once, in the kitchen, with the window open, and then they let the name find its own way into the house. On the morning of her first birthday, Abel was sitting on the porch with the child on his knee. Clara had come out with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. She sat beside him on the swing and leaned her head against his shoulder. The morning was the kind of morning that does not need to announce itself. The kind of morning a man can drink from a cup without thinking about anything at all. The coffee was strong. The child was warm. The land that had not belonged to them had become theirs, and it was theirs in the way land becomes yours when you have bled for it, and wept for it, and chosen it again every morning when you could have chosen to leave. She said, "Sometimes I think the hardest thing he did was not what he took from us. It was that he made us believe the world was the kind of place where people like him always win. He said he did not win." She said, "I know." He said he never did. They sat on the porch while the sun came up over the land they had chosen, and the coffee cooled in their hands, and the child fell asleep against his chest, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods the way it had moved through them for 100 years before any of them had been born, and would move through them for 100 years after, and the Renner ranch was whole, and no one would ever be able to take it from them. Next, we will tell the story of a woman who walked into a boomtown saloon in a long-forgotten mining town with a satchel of letters and a name written on the inside of her wrist, looking for the man who had signed his brother's death warrant, and the bartender who recognized both names from a single look at her face. It is not the story you think it is. We will see you there.